Hello everyone, this is Chromý and together we will continue the course Interdisciplinary Approaches to Language and its Use. In this presentation we will focus on human memory and how it is related with language. Memory is typically understood as a complex system with just three mutually connected capacities. A capacity to encode, in other words to enter information into the system, a capacity to store information, and a capacity to retrieve it. This is important because we may be used to think about memory primarily as a storage. But the capacity to encode information is crucial for storage, and the capacity to retrieve information from memory is necessary to be able to use this information for various purposes, such as for language processing. On this slide you can see a schema of a so-called MODAL model of the memory. This is something typically presented in the high school Introduction to Social Sciences, at least in the Czech Republic. It distinguishes three separate memory systems. First is sensory memory, which refers to a brief storage of information within a specific sensory modality. For example, if you look into the light and close your eyes, you can still see the light for a short amount of time. This would be an example of visual sensory memory. But sensory memory may refer to various senses, not only to visual sense. Second system is called short-term memory, and in this model it refers to the short retention of information, typically for a few seconds. Information stored in this short-term memory may be later transferred to long-term memory, in which it is stored for a long time, if not for the rest of the life of the given person. This model has various weaknesses. Contemporary views of the memory systems emphasize not only the storage of information, but also various processes that operate on stored information. Also, it is clear that information flows in both directions between the memory systems. In other words, long-term memory influences the short-term memory and also the sensory memory. Our knowledge of the world influences what we store in the memory, what we attend to, how we process information, and so on. One key difference between the MODAL model and various contemporary models of memory is that the contemporary models do typically replace the short-term memory with a more elaborated concept of working memory. As I said, the short-term memory is typically conceived as a storage of small amounts of information for a very short time. However, this is very limited because it does not cover the processes which operate on stored information. The concept of the working memory, on the other hand, covers both the storage or retention of information, but also the manipulation of information. We may say that the short-term memory is seen as a temporary store, whereas the working memory as a mental workspace, which is crucial for reasoning, comprehension, learning, and so on. Let's now turn our attention to the long-term memory. Here we can see a schema from the book Memory by Alan Badley, Michael Eysenck, and Michael Anderson. Crucially, long-term memory is understood as a system of various subsystems. On one hand, there is an explicit or declarative memory. This subsystem is accessible intentionally. When we think about long-term memory, we typically think just about the explicit memory. On the other hand, we have implicit or non-declarative memory, which is sometimes also called procedural memory. This subsystem is not accessible directly, but is crucial to our lives. For example, various implicit rules or our motor skills are stored in the implicit memory. The explicit or declarative memory is further divided into episodic and semantic memory. Episodic memory is reserved for individual experiences, whereas in the semantic memory we store the knowledge of the world. The distinction between explicit and implicit memory is quite important from the linguistic point of view. According to the declarative procedural model, which has been proposed by Michael Ullmann, the declarative and procedural memory are crucial for two aspects of language. In the declarative or explicit memory, we store words their meanings, idioms, proverbs, and also irregular forms. In the procedural memory, or implicit memory, we store various implicit linguistic rules, such as grammatical rules or phonological rules. Ullmann also claims that the procedural or implicit memory is responsible for prediction in language processing. Importantly, the two systems interact with each other. This may be well seen in the acquisition of a second language. For example, we may learn certain grammatical rules explicitly and store it in the explicit memory, which then helps the procedural memory in the implicit acquisition of rules. Before we will conclude this presentation, I have one reading tip for you. If you are interested in memory, you should read this book by Ellen Bedley, Michael Eysenck, and Michael Anderson. The third edition has just been published. If you enjoy the presentations, we would be glad if you would like them on YouTube. That is all from me now. See you next time.